check in to see you're good.
Yes, thank you so much.
Awesome. All right, good luck. I'll see y'all.
Thank you. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. We are so excited to be able to be here speaking with you all today. Today, we're going to be talking about how we identified and addressed inefficiencies within our area and how you can do the same within your own departments. We are going to have our presentation up for everyone to see today so you can follow along as we do some self-guided pause reflections throughout our presentation. So today we are going to be discussing, of course, how to identify inefficiencies and gain buy-in. We're going to talk about how to let technology work for you, how to know if you have too much or too little information, and how to centralize processes and redistribute essential functions to make room for improvements. But before we do all of that, we would love to introduce ourselves. My name is Audrey Davis. I am the Assistant Director of Personnel with Texas Tech University Student Housing. I've been with our department for about 8 years professionally, and in this position for just under 1 year. And I'd now like to introduce my colleague Lindley, who's going to be presenting with me today.
Hello, my name is Lindley Harrell. I'm Analyst 1, and I have been with Texas Tech University Student Housing for 3 years now, and unfortunately you can't see me due to some technical difficulties.
Well, we wish we could see your face, Lindley, but we are so happy that we can hear you today. So before we get started, we would like to provide you all with some context to help paint a picture of how our area of the department is structured and what triggered this entire process for us. So our personnel area consists of 5 individuals. There's myself, there's Lindley, we have 2 senior analysts and a student assistant. And our personnel area runs all of personnel for university student housing and hospitality services, which are 2 of the university's largest auxiliary departments, and together employ close to 1,000 employees. And we manage everything from the onboarding to the payroll, and we act as liaisons between our staff and the university's main human resources department. Now, because of all of our centralization efforts and redistributing our functions, we've added to our list of services to include full-time staff recruitment and additional programs for employee engagement and retention, which has been really neat. So, what triggered this whole process for us? Well, in January of 2020, our former colleague who led the personnel area retired. Now, retirement is often a rare phenomenon that occurs because when someone quits or resigns, it's with minimal notice. Sometimes we have a 2 weeks notice, sometimes a month, or in states like Texas that are at will, sometimes we're only given less than 24 hours. So when that happens, we work to fill that position quickly because we want to limit the impact to the personnel and to production. Because when someone suddenly leaves, we have to delegate their tasks. Some tasks are left unfulfilled, and the staff that are taking on those extra tasks, they begin to feel the strain of that additional workload. But when somebody retires, in most cases, we know about it, and we know about it well in advance. This gives us time to plan, but most importantly, it gives us opportunity. And that's our first tip for you today. When looking to make a critical change to a process, look for those timing opportunities that are handed to you, like retirement, academic year. Remember that timing of change. So shortly after our personnel colleague announced their retirement, a colleague on our departmental leadership team also announced they would be retiring. So we were provided with not just 1, but 2 opportunities for change. So 2 months later, it's March of 2020 now, I was approached by our director who informed that the recent retirements opened the door to merge 2 sectors of our department into one. He also offered me the opportunity to take on leadership of the personnel area. And at the time, I was working in residence life as the manager of recruitment. So this offer came with the request to bring my work with full-time recruitment into the personnel along with new ideas and initiatives. Now, I was given this information at about 4 p.m. on a Friday. And this is near the beginning of those COVID-19 shutdowns. And we were told that day that we would be working from home for the next 2 weeks. 2 weeks turned into 5 months. Now, we say that we all know that COVID-19 changes to the way we work. And housing and universities, housing departments and universities across the nation, we've had to develop changes quickly. And Texas Tech has been no exception to this. So our personnel area worked very hard to make many modifications for our staff. But despite that additional work, we still took the time to sit down and develop plans and make ideas for changes and initiatives. And that's our next tip for you today. While timing is important to the successful implementation of change, there will never be a good time to plan for that change. You must make the time and surround yourself with a team who is willing to contribute and put in the effort. So our first pause for reflection today is going to be to ask yourself, what are some timing opportunities that you have? Is there a time of year that works best for your department? Are there future retirements on the horizon? Maybe someone's going to be leaving soon? And who in your department would you want on your team when planning for this? Give everyone a moment to pause and think about those questions. Okay, so we're now going to talk about how to identify those inefficiencies and gain buy-in. And this particular section is where we plan to spend the most time today. So there are many ways that we can go about identifying inefficiencies, but today we're going to focus on the 4 simple steps that were successful for us and will likely be successful for you as well due to how easy it is to implement these tactics. So the very first thing we did, we started paying attention to the questions that we were asking ourselves about our processes. And these questions, they came in the form of, why is this so tedious? Or why are we filling out both forms? Is there a way to make? Our minds are always identifying inefficiencies in our subconscious all of the time. We just never take a moment to pause and pursue those thoughts. So when these thoughts happened for us, we took a moment to write them down. And when you all go back into your daily routines, you might be surprised to find out how many times a day these types of thoughts will go through your mind. So when they went through our minds, like I said, we wrote them down because we're not always in a position where we can sit down and consider the why and the how. But writing them down allows you to go back when you do have the time and start answering those questions. The next thing we did, we simply started talking to each other. If you have been having thoughts about inefficiencies, it's very likely that your staff and your colleagues are having very similar thoughts. And seeking input when doing something like this, it's crucial because it brings a full perspective to the operation that's in question. And it's also important because depending on the role you all play within your departments, it's easy to become disconnected from processes that you don't work with often. So go and talk to the people who are working with these processes every day and find out what their why and their how questions are. And in doing this, you're going to be very surprised to learn not only what ideas are out there, but what things you didn't know about the process that exists. So after we wrote down our thoughts and we started having our conversations, we sat down and we conducted a thorough review of our processes. And when you get to this step, what we recommend doing and what we did was we created a visual roadmap for each process or each operation that was in question. And we took that process and we went step by step, step by step sub-step for every point along that map. So once you've made that roadmap and you get to the end, what we want you to do is go back and travel that map. Stop at every point along the way and ask yourself, why do we need this step? What does it achieve? Can the subpoints in this step be reduced or eliminated? How can this step be improved or provide a better service? And do we need to add a step here to provide that better service? Repeat that process until you reach the end of your map. And when you reach the end of your map, ask yourself, was I able to answer every question? Did I make significant changes or additions to this process? And if I were to pursue these changes, how many people would be impacted? And what level of approval would I need to receive to move forward with this? So what we want to do now is take a moment of pause for reflection, and we want you to ask yourselves, what are some of your how and why questions that you can start turning into roadmaps? Okay, so the last step we used in the to identify resistance. With any type of proposed change that we push forward, there's always going to be pushback. The key is to figure out where that pushback is coming from. Is it a person? Is it a group of people? Is it a financial reason? Is it a policy? Now, we often blame policy for our inability to make a change, but what we forget is that policy is created by people. And sometimes those people are sitting in the office next to you, or those people no longer work for the department. We always tend to think of policy as something that's created in a room full of lawyers in a high-rise building, but that's not always the case. Being able to find out where the policy is and seeing what power you have to change it, as well as identifying this resistance, that's going to be what helps to guide you when you get into your development phase. And it's also going to be what helps to create your opportunity for buy-in. Now, one of the areas where we used this whole inefficiency identifying tactic was with our staff onboarding process. So after we conducted our review, we were able to determine that a significant change to our current practice would not only be incredibly beneficial to our team, but for our staff as well. We also knew that this would require approval at multiple levels, and it was going to impact every hiring manager within the department. So with that in mind, we were able to begin the hard part. And that was developing a plan for the changes and gaining buy-in from our departmental leadership and affected stakeholders. But before we jump into that section, I'm going to turn it over to Lindley, and she's going to talk about how we use the tactic, what the like, and what were some of those areas that we identified on our roadmap that needed to be changed. Lindley?
Thank you, Audrey. University Student Health is a customer service-driven department. We're here to serve students, and our onboarding process followed accordingly, or we like to think it did. Hospitality services, student positions are all pooled and open to allow for year-long or year-round hiring. So to accommodate this, we had an open-door policy, which meant no appointments, and supervisors and managers would bring the students to our offices whenever they happened to arrive. Students applied, interviewed, were offered the position, and then they were sent over to our offices for onboarding. They were given a paper packet that had about 6 required new employee forms. This included the W-4 and other institutional and departmental documents. We checked the packets, completed I-9s and E-Verifies, and then we processed an EPAF, which is just a personnel form that establishes their active position within our systems. In theory, this is an okay process, but there were major factors that made this process exceptionally inefficient. The first and most glaring being the open door, no appointment needed aspect of our policy. We lacked the control and appropriate time needed to assist each student in their onboarding. Second, the time of day and number of students that would arrive at our offices created a massive amount of congestion, and it could and often would be made worse by students having questions about the forms they were filling out or not providing acceptable I-9 documentation we needed. Third, the lack of time made evident the errors that would happen on I-9s and other paperwork when we checked the packets at the end of the day. The compounding effect of not having the appropriate amount of time with each student and only having the time to check packets at the end of the day is frequent delays in the completion of onboarding and processing EPAFs in a timely manner.
So, based on what Lindley's shared, you can only imagine what resulted during our busy hiring times. And when we talk about a busy hiring time, we mean hiring 40 to 70 students every single week. So we sat down and we developed a plan to address all of these inefficiencies. Our new plan provided a streamlined digital process for both university student housing and hospitality services. So new employees would now complete all of that paperwork at home prior to coming to a scheduled appointment instead of waiting 45 minutes to an hour and then having to fill out paper packets. The new process also allowed each new employee to have individual attention. We were able to make sure that their paperwork is complete. We could answer their questions. And the new process significantly reduced the amount of paper that was being used, and it also limited the number of emails that were being exchanged. So what was before a 30 to 45 minute to an hour process for each student was now a 5 to 10 minute appointment process. So it significantly reduced the time. And before we go back into and start revisiting having the discussion and starting the conversation with leadership and gaining buy-in, I do want to close the loop for you all and let you know that we were able to successfully implement all of these changes, and we did make some adjustments along the way, but we have seen success with every single change that was made. So we'll now transition back, and we want to talk about gaining that buy-in and talking with your departmental leadership. So when you're going through a process like this, remember that it's not enough to simply identify inefficiencies if you're wanting to produce real change. You must identify where improvements are needed and develop a realistic plan to address those needs. Developing our roadmap and creating a detailed proposal for our plan of action, that's what gave us the tools and the fuel we needed to take this process to the next level and start that communication with our departmental leadership. Now, when we're talking about a detailed proposal, the proposal we created for this onboarding process ended up being 20 to 30 pages that truly outlined every single detail. So we recommend, it might not be 20 or 30 pages, but we recommend creating something very detailed. And once you've completed all of that work, you want to be able to gain the buy-in. So we recommend going in and scheduling a meeting with your departmental leadership and providing them a copy of your proposed ideas for change beforehand. We want you to avoid going into this conversation before you are ready, because the higher up the chain you go, the more important it will be to have well thought out ideas and plans in place. And having that information readily available is going to help you gain that buy-in that you want, because it's going to allow these individuals to see the full picture of what it is that you're wanting to do. We also want you to remember that all change is a two-way street. So if you're wanting to gain buy-in, remember that you have to be flexible and open to ideas and adjustments to your plan of action. Be prepared to walk out of these meetings with an entirely new plan or major revisions to your proposal. And just remember to not take things personal, because the constructive feedback that you're receiving, that's going to be what leads to a realistic plan of action that's not only going to meet your needs, but serve in the best interest of all invested parties. So we want to take another moment of pause now. And we want you to write down or think about what your chain of command looks like. Who do you have to go to within your department to receive approvals? And does that change if you're wanting to make major changes versus minor changes? Okay. So let's say that you've gone through the chain of command and you've made all of your revisions and you are given the green light to proceed with your changes. Well, now it's only really begun because now we have to gain buy-in by those individuals who are going to be affected by our change. So to get everyone on board, what we did and what we recommend doing is providing detailed communication about what the changes entail and why they are being made. We want you to focus on the positive impact the changes will make and the benefits that are going to be provided to the department. We also want you to make sure that you're setting your plan up for success. Develop trainings for staff that's going to be impacted, or schedule informational sessions for staff to be able to have an open Q&A. And also, just remember to be an open and transparent person that they can go to and get the details that they need. Because change is very difficult for people to process. And we lose buy-in when we simply send an email that says, here are the changes and they'll be effective this date. When we fail to provide answers and details, we fail to generate buy-in. So be transparent and be open to making some adjustments along the way. We now want to take a moment for self-reflection, and we want you to think about some changes that you want to make and who might be impacted by your changes. So for the remainder of our presentation, Lindley and I are going to discuss some key areas where we found some very unexpected inefficiencies, and we're going to provide you with some tips on what you can look for within your own areas. And we're going to start out by talking about technology, and I'm going to turn it over to Lindley.
So we are immersed in technology in the workplace. All of our day-to-day tasks are made easier by these developments. Using software like Microsoft 365 can make workflow more efficient and information more accessible to you and your team. So why work harder when you can work smarter by taking advantage of platforms that can take care of the tedious tasks? In our case, to put it quite simply, our previous processes did not utilize any software that would streamline or ease our workload in any real significant way. And what we did use would often cause consistency issues with the employment records we kept. Prior to March 2020, our databases were maintained in 2 Excel spreadsheets and saved in a protected folder. These spreadsheets were updated daily, weekly, or monthly, but we really had no consistent update schedule. And the limitations of Excel often made it difficult to keep accurate and up-to-date employee information. Access to these spreadsheets were also hampered due to the fact that only one staff member could edit the spreadsheets at a time. It also created room for human error, deleting rows, entering information in the wrong row, not properly alphabetizing a name, that's my fault, typing over information. But more importantly, our databases lack the necessary information to effectively and efficiently post new positions and process EPAFs. Whether it was a general reluctance to use new technologies or that we were just so overwhelmed by the cumbersome processes that we didn't have time to consider updating, or just a combination of both, it supported and encouraged a mentality within our unit that we must protect the status quo, even to our own detriment. Though the underutilization of technology left our unit working much harder on little time-consuming tasks, the silver lining there was that it left the door open to take advantage of platforms like Microsoft Teams or Forms, and working together with our IT department to create match forms or mock forms that would facilitate the easy flow of information to the appropriate parties. We explored what these platforms could do for us and how we could use them for our new practices involving appointment requests for student onboarding or online database formats that made employee information more readily available to us.
So we now want to take a moment and we want you to think about what are some areas of your department that you have these tasks that you have to complete, and maybe they could be made easier if you were using technology or specific software. What software does your department have available? Is there software available at the university level that you could be looking at? Okay. So the next area we're going to talk about is figuring out if you have too much or too little information. This is where we found an inefficiency, and we found that sometimes if you have too much or too little, it does cause a process inefficiency. So as part of our transition to utilizing technology, we really started looking at the types of information we were collecting and storing. And we also looked at where we were going to find that information. And when we did this, it actually helped us to identify some subpoints on our individual roadmaps that could be significantly reduced and in some cases completely eliminated. So for example, we were working in transitioning our employee database to an online program. So we took some time to analyze our information. What we noticed is that we were still collecting employee social security numbers. Now, the university moved to unique identification numbers back in 2009. We also noticed that we were still collecting staff demographic information, which is already collected by the Texas Tech Human Resources Department. And we also found that we had files that were dating back to the 1990s. So in one sitting, this was about 15 minutes, we discovered that not only were we collecting irrelevant information, we were possibly threatening compliance laws, which was scary. So upon further review, we also learned that every single time we were going to hire or terminate or move an employee, we were having to download multiple reports to complete one action on one employee. And we found that that was adding a lot of time to multiple processes. So to address this, we sat down and we determined what information we actually needed. And we then replaced the irrelevant information in our database. And making this minor change removed 2 to 3 subpoints from multiple processes. And it saved time. What was previously taking us 20 minutes to complete an action on an employee was now taking us 10 minutes or less. So when you all are working with your inefficiency roadmaps, try to determine if you and your team have access to the right information when completing a process. Ask yourself, is the information you have relevant? Can it be collected somewhere else? Does it directly produce results in a process? And if not, make the necessary adjustments. And I think you'll be really pleased to find how a very small change can actually produce really big results. So we now want to take a moment to pause, and we want you to think about what type of information are you collecting with the process? Is it relevant? Do you need to take some time to analyze what you're collecting? Okay. So our next section, we're going to talk about how to identify when you have too many cooks in the kitchen. And it's this section that inspired our title for our presentation today. And this inefficiency revealed itself after a review of our recruitment process, as well as a review of our parking and driver approval and access requests. So prior to our changes, staff recruitment and parking and access requests and driver approval, it was all handled by individual areas of the department. Some areas had a point person, some areas asked for assistance from their support staff, and other areas had those items handled by individual supervisors. So in terms of access and parking and driver approvals, what we learned is that our external stakeholders did not have a single point person to contact within our department. There was a lot of confusion being created. There was access requests not always being made on time, or it would be made when someone started but not when someone left. And what we found was that in some cases when someone was terminated from their position, sometimes they would maintain their parking permissions. And so we found some significant inconsistencies there. Now regarding our recruitment, we learned that the staff implementing recruitment efforts often had no experience in recruitment. So they were having to learn tasks like posting requisitions, developing interview questions, creating position descriptions. And this process, for anyone who's worked with recruitment, you know it's a very time-consuming process. And so our supervisors and point people were having to learn this, and it was taking time away from their essential functions. In addition to that, all of our candidates were receiving a very inconsistent experience with our department, and there were errors being made in our applicant system, which delayed our hiring process. So if you all encounter something like this on your individual roadmaps, ask yourself, does this process make sense taking place within its current area? Or would it be better served if we moved it somewhere else or combined it? So to address all of these issues, we decided that we would centralize all parking and access requests, our driver approvals, and all of our full-time recruitment efforts into the personnel office. So if you decide to pursue something like this and do a large-scale centralization to address an inefficiency, be prepared to define exactly who will be taking over what tasks and what tasks will remain with the previous areas. And that's going to help to minimize confusion. So in this case, we clarified that our office would manage and post all positions through our hiring platform. We would submit external ad requests. We would handle all social media. We would also manage the requisitions from the posting all the way to the closing, including the development and completion of a hiring matrix, which is a requirement from our HR department. We further defined that we would handle all candidate communication, interview scheduling, and we would conduct the reference checks. To centralize the parking and access requests, what we did is we worked with our IT and support area along with our external stakeholders, and we developed a form which is now completed any time an action is taken on an employee that sends out to the appropriate stakeholders. And to centralize our driver approvals, we determined that I would be the point person for all of those for our department. So keep in mind when centralizing a large process that when you do this, it's going to have a major impact on the affected staff. I mean, to do what we were doing, taking out recruitment and taking out all of these access requests, in some cases it was taking away a lot of job duties from individuals who were considered the point person for those tasks. And in some cases, we had to restructure the essential functions of staff members to provide them with new tasks to perform. And we also had to navigate those staff members who were not thrilled about giving up these functions. Because anytime we're doing a major change like this, just know there is going to be an impact to morale. So the way we chose to handle this and what we recommend is to be open and honest about why there's a need to centralize. And what we did is we gave the affected individuals an opportunity to participate in providing ideas and developing the new process. In many cases, low morale due to changes like this one, they're caused by feelings of possessiveness over a process. And that's not necessarily a terrible thing. Having employees who care about their work is incredibly positive. So when you implement these substantial changes, make the impacted team feel valued and give them a voice in the process. So we now want to take a moment to pause, and we want you to think about what areas of your department might have too many cooks in the kitchen. Is there a process that could take place with one area instead of 4? Or could you combine a process to create less steps? Okay. So the last thing we want to discuss with you all today is how to make room for your process improvements. Now, the examples we have shared with you today, they're just a few of the major updates that we have made to the personnel area over the last year. And we have more on the horizon that's going to include an offboarding program, a staff transition program, monthly and quarterly newsletters, and we have multiple recognition and retention programs in place. So If you think back to the very beginning of our presentation today, we informed that our area has 4 full-time staff members and 1 student assistant, and Lindley and I are included in that 4. So we had to figure out how to add all of these centralized processes and new initiatives and do it in a balanced and fair manner. So to do this, I asked each member of the personnel team to complete a task log. This task log was designed to show what tasks were completed every 30 minutes over the course of a week. This log was used as a learning tool, and it helped me to really see where each staff member was spending their time. And what we did is we asked them to be very honest. Tell us when you go to lunch. Tell us when you take a walk around the building. If you're on social media, if you're visiting with colleagues. Because what we really wanted was to get the best representation of what each day looks like. And so Lindley is actually going to tell you a little bit about her real-world experience being asked and actually completing this task.
When we were informed that we needed to begin taking note of our daily tasks, I thought, great, this is just one more thing that I have to worry about. But once I started notating my tasks, I began to see the issues. I felt as if I could never get what I needed done during the day. And it became very apparent that there was a lack of productivity because I was emailing this person or that person, checking this inbox or that inbox, submitting these EPAFs, but getting distracted with new emails. I was preoccupied by these necessary but time-consuming tasks and never really getting anything done.
So through this and doing that, we were able to identify, as Lily's mentioning, we were able to identify the major inconsistencies in the amount of work being performed by each staff member. And then we were able to rearrange their essential functions to balance the amount of work while making the room for those new initiatives and those centralized processes. And what this redistribution of tasks offered was the opportunity for our staff to not only become cross-trained, but also to work in areas and gain new skill sets in areas that they might not have worked with before. And so I'm going to bounce it back to Lindley, and she's going to talk a little bit about what that was like having some of her essential functions redistributed.
So as we transitioned and things shifted into their current place, it did become clear that there was a disproportionate amount of work being done amongst the unit, and it simply had to do with the nature of each department's policy. To use student onboarding as an example again, housing utilizes Connexa brass ring for the hiring of student staff, which, as you may know, automates many of the steps that hospitality had to do manually. So much of my time was spent emailing students to send forms to be filled out, coordinating appointment times, checking documents, completing I-9s and E-Verifies. And when that was all done, having to complete EPAFs and other administrative forms, it just seemed like there wasn't enough time in the day, even though my colleagues were assisting because they had more downtime than I did. The ineffective and frustrating aspect of it was very evident. So when certain duties were taken from me and replaced with others that made more sense and that I would benefit from, it was as if the jigsaw puzzle that had been previously forced into shape was being realigned into an easier, more understandable shape.
So when you all are looking at someone's essential functions, we tend to forget that we are the ones who define those functions. As long as the tasks remain within the position's scope of work, we have the ability to rearrange and redistribute. So don't forget to use this ability as a resource whenever you're able. So to close out today, and before we move into our Q&A session, Lindley and I just wanted to provide some personal reflections on this entire year and this process. For me, this was a year that was filled with a lot of learning experiences and great opportunities. I was very humbled to have such an incredible team who was willing to jump on board and not only go through a pandemic, but go through a complete restructure of our area. I personally would not recommend making as many changes as we have in just 10 months. It is very time consuming and it is very hard on the staff, but be aware that once you start this process. It's a very good process to start, but once you start it, it could have a chain reaction, which is what happened to us. Because we changed this one thing, we had to change another process and another, and that's what led to 10 months of significant change. But at the end of the day, I am glad that we did it. I do feel that we truly offer better services to our staff and to our new employees, and I personally look forward to future changes down the road. How about you, Lindley?
The term "these unprecedented times" has grown pretty cliche in the wake of the pandemic, but unprecedented is a great descriptor of what took place following Audrey's move into her position. Given the previous lack of motivation to change and move toward better policies and processes, it was a big shift into uncharted territory. There was a learning curve and growing pains during our restructuring for sure, and count on the same being an inevitability in your department as well. But in our case, it was a situation where the ends justified the means. During your transition, do remember to keep the lines of communication open to your staff. We have one-on-ones, and they were essential during our transition, especially when maintaining morale. They were safe spaces to air concerns and or just communicate staff to supervisor about what we do and how we do it. If there is pushback from your team, use these meetings and have an open and honest conversation with them to learn and understand their concerns. With time and proper implementation, you'll find that your whole team is on board. These new policies have given us control where we severely lacked in previous years. And as Audrey said, it has led us to offer better and more consistent services to our employees.
Thank you, Lindley. So we would now like to answer your questions. I'm just now able to see the chat, and it sounds like there was some great sandwiches made. And Kenny, we probably did have your file as we were going through things, so I appreciate seeing that. But yes, we'd now love to answer any questions that you all may have for us today. And you can see that we've also provided our email addresses. And so if you think of questions later on, or if you just need to talk about making a change or get some more ideas, please feel free to reach out to us. We would be more than happy to connect and have those conversations with you all. What HR systems do we use? There's various HR systems for hiring. We use Connexa Brass Ring. That's a system that we use a lot. There are some Texas Tech specific systems when we're working with payroll. We use Time Clock Plus is a system that we use. And then in working with onboarding, we have utilized Microsoft Teams. JC says, would you elaborate or provide a specific example of how it was more efficient for some or other person to unit to take on additional responsibilities? The point being that it adds work to someone, but makes the overall entire department work more effectively. So, you know, when we talked about those time logs, you know, you have to really look and see what area can absorb those types of tasks. Because yes, if you assign it to the wrong area, yes, it can have a negative impact. So just be sure to find out areas that have room. Because of our task logs, we were able to find out that there was room to add these things, and it made more work, but because we redistributed our team's essential functions, we were able to do that. So for example, Lindley was working with our hospitality side of things, and that was doing the appointments, meeting with the students, emailing the students, completing all of the EPAFs and everything for hospitality. Whereas on the housing side, we had one person who was doing the appointments and then one person who was doing the EPAFs. So to balance it out, what we did is we created one person who just does EPAFs. Lindley just works with hospitality appointments, and another person just works with housing. So that's how we balanced it, because now suddenly there was 3 hours available in the day. So I hope that helps to provide a little bit of information on how we did that. And in creating that message, it's just really about why we need to do this. Yes, it's taking items away, but it's going to be better. And in some cases, yes, it was adding more work, but it actually saved a lot of time centralizing. So it didn't take up as much time, because what was taking 20, 30 minutes for one area now takes us 5 minutes. So there's more work, but the time was not as straining on the person who was receiving that work. Andy asked, do you have one thing you wouldn't do if you could go back? One thing I wouldn't do if I could go back, it would probably just be to do so many changes in one sitting in 1 year. As I mentioned, I think, like I mentioned, this was very difficult to do. Also, I was new to the area. Now, fortunately, I already had some great relationships with the individuals in the personnel area, but I would like to have gone back and worked in our current processes a little longer, but just the way it was set up and the change that was occurring, plus the way we were having to make some changes for COVID-19 forced it. But I would have liked to have worked in the old process for a little while before doing that. And then Joel asks, was there a specific change that your upper administration said, no, you can't make that proposed change? If so, did that mess up other changes that you were hoping to make? And if so, how did you navigate? Yes, that's an excellent question. So we've mentioned that we're working with both university student housing and hospitality services. So university student housing said, yes, let's do it. And we did it, and it was great now in regards to onboarding. Hospitality services has been a little more reserved throughout this process and said, no, we're not making the transition to things into teams versus sending a traditional EPAF. So what we've did is we've navigated that process. We've made the adjustments to meet our hospitality services area's needs. But what I've done is I've been working with our director there and going to recreate some of the pieces that we did for housing to make sure that it's fitting their needs, because they are open to these new processes, but because of some of their specific needs, it's just going to have to be a little more tailored. So we're working on that, and that's going to be kind of our phase 2 of this process, is to fully get our hospitality services on board. And I think part of it was also saying, that's okay. We know that's a big change, but it was being flexible and open to saying, yes, we can work with you, and instead of doing your changes all at once, we can do them gradually. So I hope that helped to answer that question there. Thank you all so much for these incredible questions, and we appreciate some of the positive feedback we're seeing in the chat there. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Audrey and Lindley. If everyone can give them a round of applause for a wonderful presentation. I dropped in the chat a flyer for you guys. If you could scan the QR code to complete the program evaluation, that would be great. So again, thank you so much, Audrey and Lindley. That was a great presentation.
Thank you so much to all of you. We truly appreciate spending some time with you today.
Yes, thank you. This was exciting.